Tonight's speaker, Dr. Danielle Allen, has earned acclaim both as a scholar and as a public policy advocate. She ranges with ease from ancient Greek philosophy to today's debates about education and equality. Beyond publishing 14 books with the 15th on the way, Allen has founded many civic initiatives and has been recognized by countless honors, including a MacArthur Genius Grant and the Kluge Prize for the study of humanity. During the height of COVID, Allen helped draft policies that were adopted in federal legislation, a process she discussed earlier today with Rebecca Tuvel's clinical bioethics seminar. She then ran for governor, making history as the first Black female candidate for Massachusetts statewide office. What unites her daunting array of achievements is her commitment to language-rich democracy, past, present, and future. For over a decade, I've been eager to have Rhodes College host Dr. Allen ever since she published her award-winning book, Our Declaration. She has that great teacher's knack for posing arrestingly clarifying analogs. The Declaration is like a memo. The Declaration is like a divorce. The Declaration is like a potluck. Most importantly, it's our declaration, which she makes manifest by reading it slowly, down to the level of a word, even down to the level of a punctuation mark. As I like to tell my students, this isn't just careful reading, it's care-filled reading. Yet even as she decelerates her reading, she doesn't ignore context, weaving together insights from philosophy, political theory, religion, media studies, textual archaeology, histories of race and gender, and languages and literatures ancient to modern. As Allen excavates the human record, she scaffolds our minds for possible paths forward. Now, as we all know, any anniversary gives us the opportunity to pause, gives us a chance to look back as well as a chance to look forward. Here at Rhodes, we recently celebrated the 20th anniversary of our Barrett Library, and we're currently in the midst of reflecting on a century of the Rhodes campus here in Memphis. As we anticipate next summer's 250th anniversary of 1776, you can already sense that this will be a contentious commemoration. There will be some who will idolize the Declaration, treating it almost as a sacred document or even a kind of monument frozen in time. There will be others who will scoff at this monumentalization, yet thereby leave little to stand in its wake. Allen offers us a better way than idolization or iconoclasm. She reminds us that the Declaration was a product of many human hands and many human moments, and that we can renovate this human record whenever we devote the time to make it ours. When Tocqueville spoke of the habits of democracy, I like to think that he was imagining Danielle Allen, who practices these habits of democracy in every aspect of her life. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good evening. Beautiful, thank you. Professor Newstock, that was such a beautiful introduction, thank you. It's actually a rare thing to be introduced by somebody who's actually read your books. Thank you, it's a true honor. And thank you, President Collins. It's wonderful to be on your campus. And the Wilson family, thank you for your support of the humanities and of the humanities in public spaces. It's so important for our souls that we have the chance to engage in real reflection about the most basic questions. How shall I live? How shall we live? And that is fundamentally the work of the humanities. And thank you to all of you for being here. I know life is incredibly busy and pressed, but you've made time to be here. That's a huge gift, so thank you. I also know that this is a time where our whole society feels incredibly raw. And so also a thank you for being willing to come together and to spend some time thinking out loud with me about who we are as a country, why our origins still matter, and how, despite all the complexity of our history, they can indeed still be a resource for us as we navigate the present moment. So when Scott said that it wasn't just a careful reading of the Declaration, but care-filled, I thought he was going to say it wasn't just careful, but obsessive. That's where I thought we were headed. So you're very generous. It's true, I am kind of obsessed with the Declaration of Independence. And I find myself in the surprising position of having lived with it intimately for 25 years, which, when I stop and think about it, is 1/10 of the life of our nation. We are that young a country still. And in fact, I'm in my 50s, which means I've been alive for 1/5 of the life of our country. Wow. Well, adolescents have growing pains. And I think that's about where we are in our situation. As a free people, seeking, as Lincoln asked us to seek, to answer the question of how to build institutions for a free and equal self-governing people that will endure. Not an easy question. It was hard in 1776, it was hard in the 1860s, it's hard now. But one after another generation has risen to the occasion, and we can rise to it also. So my purpose tonight, I want to share with you exactly how it is I came to be obsessed with the Declaration, why I consider it such a rich resource. I'm going to share with you some of the resources in it, though I cannot do it justice in the amount of time we have together. That is part of its incredible quality. So short, 1,377 words, and yet a universe of understanding packed into it. So I'll share some of those resources. I will also take the time to address some of the gates or fences that often keep people from walking into the Declaration, often keep people from wanting to say, oh, it belonged to them, it can't be mine. I want you to believe it is yours. And my hope is that every one of you will walk out of this room understanding that you own the Declaration of Independence, that it is yours, and that it does give you special powers. That's my hope for what we're going to try to do this evening. So I am a combination of Harvard prof and democracy advocate, and I wear a lot of hats, juggle a lot of balls, as Professor Newstock was saying. And so people often ask me, Danielle, what exactly do you really do? And the short of it is, I basically work on behalf of democracy, past, present, and future, with no question mark on the end of that, as far as I'm concerned. And I like to share that that's a focus, a kind of monomaniacal focus, that I come by honestly. It's a matter of my family inheritance. On my dad's side, my granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s. That was really dangerous work. Lynchings were on the rise at the time. So he was literally taking his life into his hands to secure the right to vote. And he did that because he believed that empowerment is the bedrock for human thriving, for individuals, families, and communities. On my mom's side, my great-grandparents fought for women's right to vote. And I love to elevate my great-granddad, who marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917. And we often don't remember just how hard it was for suffragettes in 1917. They were being locked up in prison in DC. Woodrow Wilson was not a supporter of the suffragettes. They were given terrible conditions, and some of them went on hunger strikes in prison, and they were being force-fed in very abusive ways. So it was really tough times. My great-granddad was there on Boston Common because my great-grandmother was busy having a baby, and she wanted somebody to be there to hold up the cause for the family. And then she went on to be the president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 1930s. So I was very fortunate. I grew up in a family that, again, saw empowerment as the bedrock of human thriving for individuals, families, and communities. And as a young person, I took the value of democracy for granted. As I came up in the world, though, I also found that other people in my family, my big extended family, didn't have the same close connection to our democracy, the same sense of empowerment. And in fact, my cousins, I have too many cousins who aren't with us any longer for all of the hardest things we struggle with as a society: addiction, incarceration, gun violence. My youngest cousin, my baby cousin, my favorite cousin, was incarcerated in California in the 1990s. And in that period of time, I spent a lot of time trying to help him get education inside prisons. And at the same time, I was also a young assistant professor at the University of Chicago. And I had an opportunity one day to try to help build a night program for low-income adults, working adults, people struggling to juggle 2 jobs and kids and get around Chicago on public transportation. And this was an immediately appealing prospect to me because I loved my day students at the University of Chicago, but I had a clear sense of what my cousin had missed out on and what the struggle was for him trying to get an education inside the walls of a prison. And I really wanted to also make sure that an excellent education could be available to people who maybe hadn't had all those chances. So I grabbed that opportunity to work on that night program with both hands. And then we had a puzzle as we were trying to build that program. We wanted those night students to have the same quality of education in the humanities that our day students at the University of Chicago were getting. But some of them didn't even have a high school degree, didn't even have a GED. How on earth were we going to do the same thing for those night students as for our fancy day students at the University of Chicago with their great pedigrees and terrific high school educations? So we puzzled over this, and we came to the conclusion that the solution was we would not compromise at all on the caliber of the material that we were sharing with people or the caliber of our instruction. But we would compromise on the length of the texts that we assigned. And for that completely instrumental reason, I started teaching the Declaration of Independence. 1,377 words. That's all. So I taught it in the history unit, I taught it in the philosophy unit, I taught it in the literature unit, I taught it in the writing unit, because it speaks to all of those things. And I had the most explosive teaching experience of my career. Why? Because my night students, people who were really struggling, dealing with gun violence and health problems that they couldn't address and so forth, they were all there in that class because they wanted to change their lives. And so they understood the heart of the Declaration immediately. The people who drafted that wanted to change their lives. When they say, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary, they are sharing a diagnosis of their circumstances, a set of problems that they wish to rectify. They name the principles they're going to use to rectify those circumstances, and they lay out a course of action. The Declaration of Independence is a story of human agency. That is its incredible and powerful gift. And my night students got that a lot faster than my day students, who were sort of laden down. Who were like, when exactly was the Stamp Act? And what exactly happened at the Boston Tea Party? Laden down with lots of knowledge, lots of historical detail, missing the kernel of the Declaration, which is the story of human agency. The question of how we take responsibility for our lives, work in communities with others to deliver the safety and happiness of the people. So that was the case. My students gave me the gift of seeing the power of the Declaration. And I wanted to share that power with others, and so I wrote this book, Our Declaration, which was on the title for the talk tonight. And as a result of that gift, I have literally been living with the Declaration for 25 years. I talk about it all the time. I teach it all the time. It has gone deep into my spirit. And in that place, what I've come to understand is that in that short compass, it provides us the richest and most insightful account of what it means to be a citizen of a constitutional democracy anyway. What is asked of us, and what should we expect to receive? So I want to share with you some of that. And usually what I do is start with the all-important second sentence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident sentence. And we will come to that, but I'm actually going to start in a slightly different place tonight. The Declaration has in it the incredible philosophical language, the principles, and we will come back to them. But it also has in it the long list of grievances, the very specific set of things that the colonists were complaining about what King George has done that finds them needing to seek an absolute break, a divorce. And when you study that list of grievances, you actually discover that it's not just a kind of random rattlebag of complaints. It has in it the basics of constitutional theory. The first set of complaints are about violations to the legislative power of the colonial assemblies. The second branch of complaints are about violations to the judicial power. The third branch of complaints are about violations in the use of executive power, including things like standing armies in times of peace. So there's a map there about the basics of constitutional theory. Legislative powers, judicial powers, executive powers. There's a need for each and a relationship among them that's necessary. And what it's doing in that text is making a very powerful argument, the same argument actually that the British were themselves making in London in relationship to King George. It was this, and it's a lesson that we actually don't articulate explicitly often enough. Freedom depends, you're going to say, what on earth does she mean by this? Freedom depends on legislative supremacy. What? What the heck, Danielle, is legislative supremacy? Legislative supremacy is when the body that represents the people, Parliament in England or Congress in the United States of America, sets the policy direction for society. All right? And then the executive executes the direction set by the legislature. In both England and the colonies, that's what they were fighting over. Okay? We all now look at Britain and we understand that the king has a largely symbolic role, while Parliament does the business of the country with the Prime Minister. That was an achievement of the revolutionary period in England. They had their own revolution while we were having ours, and the result of their revolution were those restraints on the king, so that Parliament could lead. And that's exactly what was sought here in the United States, which is why Congress is the first branch of government in the Constitution. Now, what exactly does legislative supremacy mean, and why does it matter? It's been eroding in this country for a long time, the whole of the 20th century. Its erosion is not a new phenomenon, all right? It has reached a supreme peak, but that erosion is not a new phenomenon. It's really important to understand it's been a long historical process and course. But the point is that when you have a legislative branch, what it is able to do is synthesize the opinion of the population from all quarters of the population. It'll have debates, it'll have arguments, it'll have 51%, 49% votes, but it is designed to be a body that is producing something synthetic from across the whole spread of the population. The executive can never be more than one person representing one point of view. And so when Congress ceases to legislate, ceases to lead, it does leave a vacuum, and the executive will fill that vacuum. And when the executive fills that vacuum, you get arbitrary whiplash back and forth between single individual wills. What do I mean concretely by arbitrary whiplash? Let me just give you one concrete example. November 2020, President Trump signs an executive order banning diversity trainings in, I believe, the military and possibly other public agencies. Okay, November 2020. January 2021, President Biden signs an executive order making equity a whole of government project. January 2025, President Trump again signs executive orders banning what's now called DEI. The language changes over that 5-year period. So that whiplash is coming from the fact that we don't any longer have legislative supremacy operating in the country. If you read the inner part of the Declaration, the list of grievances, it is an argument about why legislative supremacy is valuable to freedom. And the answer, again, is because it permits a disagreeing, argumentative, completely contradictory people to actually process those disagreements and synthesize something to find negotiated settlements. That is the work of a legislature. Is our legislature doing that? I wouldn't say so. So that will give us a lot to think about. What would it take for us to get our legislature back to doing the job of the legislature? I'm going to just leave that one there for the moment, because that was the side point for tonight, okay? Now I want to actually give you what I think is the most important resource in the Declaration, and that is its all-important second sentence. You know it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right, be honest. How many of you remembered that that sentence was that long? It is that long. It is one sentence. That is how Jefferson wrote it out. That is how the Secretary of Congress wrote it out. It is one sentence because it is what philosophers call a syllogism. All right, that means a couple of premises leading to a conclusion. Premise one, people have rights. Some examples, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Premise two, we build governments to secure those rights. Conclusion, governments aren't doing what they're supposed to do, and we've got to change them so that they will secure those rights. Okay? One sentence structured as a syllogism. That sentence has a world of philosophy in it. It is, of course, a theory of revolution. It justifies that divorce, that break from England, but it's doing a lot more than that. It is also making this point about what the work of citizenship is. And that work is really captured in the final clause of the sentence. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends of securing our rights, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it, but alter is what is appropriate in our context. It's the right of the people to alter it and to institute new government, laying the foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as shall seem to them most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Principles, a set of values. That's the foundation for government in a constitutional democracy. And then you have to figure out how to organize the powers of government. The Constitution is a document that organizes the powers of government. Policy decisions organize the powers of government. It's understanding how to work both of those things together. The Declaration laying out that commitment to basic rights is that picture of core values that we can work on and adjust over time, but it gives us an anchor point for sure. And the job of citizenship is to put that work of values together with that work of making decisions about our institutions in order to yield decisions that will lead to not my happiness, but our safety and happiness. Did you notice that when I recited the sentence? How there was that movement from my right to happiness to our safety and happiness? I'm going to repeat it so you can listen for that part, okay? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, driving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them, as to us, shall seem most likely to affect our safety and happiness. So somehow, in this work of democratic politics, we've got to start with a set of individual rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, a whole heck of a lot of 330 or 340 million different opinions on what we should do with this crazy old place called America that we love. And somehow, that has got to turn into a picture of what is most likely to affect our shared safety and happiness. How on earth does that happen? Our institutions are nothing more than a technology for negotiating our disagreements. That's their job. We are not supposed to all agree from the get-go, but we are supposed to be able to negotiate together. All right? And so, what does it take to negotiate? Well, compromise. I hate to say it, it takes compromise. So, how on earth are we supposed to get that in our current conditions? This is where the Declaration is also helpful. It has 2 compromises in it. I often think that these days we have trouble respecting the value of compromise because our history does include some really awful compromises, like the 3/5 compromise, for example, and the other compromises that entrenched enslavement. We learn that history and we think compromise is bad. What I want to say is actually there are good compromises and bad compromises. And the important thing is to learn the difference between them. The Declaration can actually teach us that difference. It has 2 compromises in it, a good one and a bad one. The good one is about religion. In the sentence I recited, you heard the word creator, all right? Created equal, endowed by their creator. There is also, later in the Declaration, the language of a supreme judge and divine providence. And at the beginning of the Declaration, there is a comment about the importance of the laws of nature and nature's God as the sort of moral foundation for the Declaration. Now, what is all that language doing? It's doing 2 things. First of all those religious terms, creator, supreme judge, divine providence, none of them is the vocabulary of any specific doctrine or church. Any faith community at all can recognize that vocabulary and have a connection to the moral foundation of the Declaration. At the same time, the phrase laws of nature and of nature's God also provides a secular basis for the moral argument of the Declaration. The laws of nature is something that you can understand as a source of morality without having to be a person of faith. And indeed, in the writing of the Declaration and in the period of the work of Continental Congress, the participants represented a variety of faiths, including atheists and deists, as well as a variety of Christian faiths. The colonies already had in them Jewish people, Muslim people. So that was a compromise that actually took into account the position of all affected by it and found language that everybody who was participating could connect to for understanding the moral foundations of the text. The negative compromise in the Declaration does relate to slavery. Our problems with slavery were there right from the beginning, and also the range of opinion was there right from the beginning. So that phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was not actually the conventional phrase in the time period for talking about basic rights. The more conventional phrase was life, liberty, and property. But in the fall of 1775, the British Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, had decreed that any enslaved person who escaped from a plantation and fought for the British would win their permanent freedom. And that decree intensely angered the Virginians. It was really what brought them into the war. And it angered them, and they began to make the case that the king was violating their rights of property. So in other words, by the fall of 1775 and spring of 1776, the idea of the right of property had been connected to a defense of slavery. But not everybody in the colonies wanted to defend slavery. John Adams, key leader in Continental Congress, did not. He never enslaved people, never supported slavery. Benjamin Franklin also had, earlier in his life, owned humans, but by the time of the Declaration had repudiated slavery and was working for abolition. They were not alone. And in fact, both Adams and Franklin worked with Jefferson and 2 other people on the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. So right from the beginning, there is an argument about slavery. It is not the case that all the founders endorsed slavery. In fact, quite the contrary. And so it's Adams, actually, the man who never held slaves, who gave us the language of happiness. He was making this argument all the way through 75 and 76. That phrase, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, is an abolitionist phrase in the Declaration of Independence. Adams actually uses that language to draft the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, before the end of the Revolutionary War. And then that Constitution was used again before the end of the Revolutionary War to abolish enslavement in Massachusetts. Did you follow me? So that's an anti-slavery moment in the Declaration, that phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the same time, in the first draft of the Declaration that the Committee of Five, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Sherman, and Livingston, that they submitted to Congress, there was a paragraph in that draft that condemned King George for the slave trade, for violating the sacred rights of life and liberty of a distant people in Africa. And Congress cut that passage out, a passage that asserted the rights of Africans, the basic human rights. And Congress did that at the insistence of those colonies, now states, that were committed to trying to maintain the institution of slavery. So that was a enslavement moment in the Declaration. So that compromise with that language of happiness was a language that allowed them all to agree that they could move forward. It was broad enough not to force the question. I, though, would call that one a bad compromise because it didn't take into account the interests of everybody affected by the decision, and specifically didn't take into account the interests of people who were enslaved. So our story is a hard one. It has injustice in it, but in the story of the Declaration I've just told, what you have in that second sentence is a story of both a good compromise, the way the religious issues were worked out, and also a bad compromise. And if we can hold on to that distinction, I believe we could revive a culture of respecting compromise, understanding how to work on it, building up our capacity to achieve settlements among ourselves in our decision making. Okay, so those were two of the resources that I wanted to give you, the theory of constitutionalism and legislative supremacy, and then this ethic of compromise that has to be at the heart of any democracy that's going to endure. I said I also wanted to address some of the gates or fences that often keep people from entering into the Declaration and taking it seriously, laying an ownership claim or stake to it. One of them we've already, in a sense, touched on. It's just the fact that we all think of Thomas Jefferson as the author of the Declaration of Independence. I'm sure you've heard somebody say, but it was written by Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder. How can we take it seriously? You've heard that, right? I'm guessing. So a few things to say about that. For starters, there are many things that Jefferson taught us. One of them is how to get credit for something, okay? Because what does his tombstone say? Author, Declaration of Independence, right? That's why we attribute the text to Jefferson. But as I've already described, it was the work of a committee. Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Sherman, and Livingston. Adams was the real intellectual architect of the work leading up to the Declaration. Jefferson built on his work. Jefferson's eloquence as a writer did do special things for the Declaration, but Adams was the architect of its intellectual structure. And the important point there is that the founding had many voices, many perspectives. The Declaration belongs as much to Adams and the abolitionist cause as it does to Jefferson and the cause of slavery. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And relatedly, also people will often say, but wait, all men were created equal? What about women, right? Like, is this really for all of us? Well, the fact is, the word men in the text is being used in a universal sense for all of humanity. We're not used to that anymore, so it sounds wrong to us, but that is indeed how they meant it. And we can learn that from the text itself. In that same passage that I described being cut out, that had the condemnation of the slave trade in it, it included a condemnation of the sale of human beings, the auctions in which, and then in Jefferson's handwriting in all caps, it says, men were bought and sold. Now, we know in those auctions that women were also bought and sold. We know that in those auctions, children were also bought and sold. So the word men, in all caps, means people, Okay, and that is also true in the phrase, all men were created equal. And I could tell you more, I won't bore you now, but there was direct acknowledgement by the founders that those principles of rights did apply to all human beings. They had huge arguments about whether or not that meant everybody should have power in political institutions, and there they decided the answer was no. And we could talk more about that in Q&A, but the important point is that the core arguments about principles, even the founders who were enslaving people understood those principles to apply to all humanity. It was a strange and mind-bending idea, but it is in fact the case. So, I want to come to the conclusion of my remarks so that we can open up our conversation by giving you what I hope will be a gift. You can tell from the way I've been talking about the text that a lot of it is inside me at this point. And I find that with the Declaration inside me, I'm able to make my way through the world, going to the grocery store and sitting at kids' soccer games and getting annoyed with my colleagues in faculty meetings, like trying to think about something else. And I think about the Declaration. Its words go through my mind. It's true. I told you I was obsessed, okay? Now you really know it's true, all right? But the point is, it's like that. You can pick it up like a carry-on, all right? Just carry it around with you. Like that is essentially what a soundbite is. Carry-on, you can carry around with you and unpack, when it's convenient. So I want you to have the second sentence as something that you can carry around with you. You may not take it away completely tonight, but I'm going to recite it one more time. And this time I want you to close your eyes while I'm reciting it. I just want you to take it, and I'm going to go really slowly, all right? And you can read it again afterwards, but I'm doing this because this is a gift. The last thing I'll say before I give you this gift is Lincoln described the Declaration as the apple of gold. The apple of gold, the source for everything. The Constitution, he said, was a silver frame around the apple of gold. And when Lincoln said that the Declaration was the apple of gold, it was this second sentence he was talking about. It is this second sentence that is the apple of gold. Okay? Close your eyes. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. But among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Thank you for listening to that. And with that, let me say thank you and invite Professor Newstock back up for our conversation.
So we will shift from the peripatetic philosopher walking around and helping us think to sitting between two ferns. And what I've done is we've solicited questions in advance from the audience. I've also asked some local high schools and students and teachers to offer questions, and I'll try to synthesize them as best as I can. I've synthesized questions from all corners of the audience. We have a question from community member Pastor Keith Caldwell, who harkens back to your undergraduate years at Princeton. And Pastor Caldwell asks, how did being a student of Dr. Cornel West shape your ability to view democracy through the lens of the Black church prophetic tradition? Was that influencing your reading of the Declaration?
Oh, wow, what a beautiful question. I want to wave and say hi. But, well, there you are. Oh, yeah, it's nice to see you. Thank you so much for that question. So that's a beautiful question, and I have to start by sharing that my granddad, that what I mentioned, who helped found that NAACP chapter, was a Baptist preacher in northern Florida. So the Black prophetic tradition is sort of deep in my DNA. And he, in some sense, was really the person from whom I had my first lessons about civic agency and empowerment. I remember visiting him as a young person in Baxley, Georgia, which is where his church was. And he was, a pastor and also, as I'm sure you know, like basically the mayor of his community. And that civic responsibility that he exhibited and the way he was able to tend to a flock were a real lesson to me about what empowerment means and that relationship between individuals, families, and communities. So I was lucky to meet Professor West as an undergraduate. And do you mind if I tell a bit of a long story? So I met Professor West in a time actually kind of like this, where there were a lot of battles on college campuses around race and issues of political correctness. And I had come to college as a young conservative kid and my dad had worked in the Reagan administration, and I had outlier political opinions on campus. My politics have changed over time. I happen to be a Democrat now, but at any rate, so the point is I had come to campus as a conservative kid, and I published some things in the campus newspaper that were not popular with other students. You probably remember some of that. And that got me a lot of ostracism and really bad treatment from other students. And word of this reached Professor West. And I was in my dorm room one day by myself because I had really fallen into ostracism and was really in a very low place. The phone rang, and I answered the phone, and this voice said, "Is that Sister Danielle?" And I said, "Yes." "This is Brother West," right? Because that's the only way he ever says hello. He's like, "I want you to come see me in my office." Well, all right, Professor Cornel West is calling me, I'm going in. And he did the most beautiful thing, which was he sat me down and asked me what I was interested in. And just talked to me about my ideas and beliefs and why I had them and so forth. And then he invited me to come to his office once a week to talk about books, whatever I was reading, things he was interested in. And we started with some ancient Greek stuff, and we ended up with Emerson and, Du Bois and all kinds of things. And he also called in the kids who'd been bullying me. And I don't know if he did the same weekly thing with them, but he changed the dynamic. And so by the end of the year, we were all actually able, it was the year of the riots in Los Angeles, the Rodney King riots. And we were all actually able to share a rally stage together and share our different thoughts about what was going on. And I'm from Los Angeles, and to share our different thoughts about what was going on in Los Angeles. And so that act of teaching, Professor West has given me many lessons, including a deeper understanding of the Black prophetic tradition for sure. And yes, his work does infuse all of my work. But what I really wanted to share was the depth of that teacher story, the power of that connection to a student, the commitment to opening up space for all views and teaching young people how to connect across all kinds of lines of difference, including viewpoint. So I owe him so much, so thank you for that question.
We have a number of questions that are kind of about the method of the book. You called it obsessive reading. In the book itself, you call it slow reading. Could you describe your approach to that method, and in particular, if you could distinguish it from the perception of originalism? How does it differ from that? Because I know you've written about what you think originalism means in the context of your own writing and your own approach to reading.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So it's funny, actually there's an interesting book by a law professor at Harvard named Adrian Vermeule called Common Good Constitutionalism, which, so he's a very conservative law professor, and the book is making the argument that originalism lost its way. And so in other words, from inside sort of originalist quarters, there's a recognition that originalism became a sort of commitment to the sort of minute precision that wasn't actually the original intention at all. So in a paradox, originalism is like actually not very originalist. Because, again, if you listen to the Declaration of Independence, right, I mean, the sentence I just recited for you says, when government becomes destructive of these entities, the right of the people to alter it. That is, we, the people, are always supposed to be considering our circumstances and evaluating whether or not how we've organized the powers of government through the Constitution and other forms, whether that's fit for purpose. And so the Declaration itself and the Constitution's commitment to an amendment process are already an education about a sort of, a commitment to the sort of original vision of a people constantly able to evaluate its circumstances and make changes as needed. So that's what I consider to be, actual originalism. And interestingly enough, as it happens, Professor Vermeule, coming from a more conservative place in terms of his work, has come to the same conclusion. So that opens up some possibilities for the conversations we might all have with each other.
So one of the rich things about the book is how committed it is to reading words intensively and caring about the language of the Declaration. In many ways, that seems to contradict the spirit of 2025. It seems like we're in a moment that doesn't care about reading with that same kind of intensity, that is focused on image-based politics. People have talked about post-literate or post-textual society, memes and vibes. In some ways, the question is about, you can give the best reading of the Declaration as you possibly can, but how does that hold up to someone or organizations that don't care about words and don't care about being committed to that kind of intensity?
Yeah, I mean, we live in a really complicated and hard time, and the collapse, I don't know if that's the right word exactly, of our media ecosystem is certainly one of our biggest problems. It's a problem because of fragmentation and polarization. It's a problem because of the just overwhelming volume of information out there to consume. It's a problem because of the lack of quality control on so much of it. So it's a lot harder to sort out the dreck from the stuff that you actually want to consume. And this is a deep problem. I can't pretend it's anything other than a deep problem. And I want to actually just say a bit more about precisely how it's a problem, because I think might help us think about what to do about it. In the period of the writing of the Constitution, when, for example, James Madison and others in the Federalist Papers were trying to articulate why they thought this saying was supposed to work, one of their biggest concerns was the threat of faction, right? We call it tribalism now, or polarization, but they called it faction. And the whole point of writing the Constitution was to design something that could address the problem of faction. And in the 10th essay in the Federalist Papers, Madison argues about what the solution is. And it's a two-pronged solution. It's funny, we tend to only these days teach one of the prongs, which has made it a little harder to see what our current problem is. So we often teach that the use of representation instead of direct democracy was a part of the solution, right? The idea being people will elect representatives, they'll be wise and virtuous, ha ha ha. And they will therefore make good decisions and filter out the kind of bad or factionalist perspectives. But that was actually only part of the solution. The other prong, Madison argued, was the breadth of the republic. It was representation in the context of a broad republic. And by broad republic, he was literally referring to the geographic dispersal of the population, the fact that the land was broken up by mountains and rivers and so forth. And he argues that because of that breadth, people with extreme views won't be able to find each other. Exactly, you got the problem. So the whole thing was designed on the idea that representation would work as a brake on extreme opinion. There would be sort of friction for it, and geography would help. We no longer have geography helping us. So we really do have to think about how we can redesign our media ecosystem so it actually does do a better job of helping us filter quality and also slow down the development and emergence of extreme opinion on either side of the political spectrum.
So a number of the questions confront what you call the shadows of the Declaration, the kind of gaps between its lofty prose and the actual situation on the ground in the colonies. So one of these is community member Lou Adams, who asks, where did the Native Americans fit in that phrase, created equal?
Great. Thank you for that question. That's a super important question. And the words the Declaration has about Native Americans are horrible. I mean, there's just no way around it. And in contrast to what I said about gender and race, there really isn't an exculpatory element around the treatment of Native Americans in the Declaration. And that was a point in time when the colonies understood themselves to be essentially involved in all-out war with Native peoples, and were, as we all know, so aggressive in that war to have effectively produced genocidal results in many contexts. And the British as well. I mean, Lord Amherst, a British general, for example, intentionally delivered smallpox-infested blankets in Massachusetts to Native tribes. So it was really at that level of technique. And so in the when the founders sort of reflected on those kind of core principles, they did embrace all of humanity, but they were only explicit about that in relationship to women and people of color, well, specifically Africans. And let me just maybe be a little more explicit about some of those conversations so you know what I mean by them. So for example, in the spring of 1776, John Adams was really the person leading this charge to the Declaration. He got back to Congress in February. He'd gone home for a winter recess, got back in February with a to-do list, and his to-do list included Declaration of Independency, okay? He was the only person with that on their to-do list. And as he was working that spring, he got a lot of letters from people who knew him, knew his politics, knew what he was trying to do, asking him questions about precisely what he was doing. So for example, his wife, Abigail, wrote to him and said, what about the ladies? This stuff is all great, but what about the ladies? Remember the ladies, she wrote to him. And she was explicit in saying, the trouble is that men have had a history of, her vocabulary, being tyrants. And so it's all well and good that you're pursuing these lofty principles, but when people have absolute power, they abuse it. So, and John wrote back and said, no, these principles are for everybody, the protection of happiness is for everybody, but what we're gonna do, he said, is we're gonna reserve the use of our, quoting him, masculine system of power, meaning we're gonna keep our masculine system of power. So he explicitly and intentionally chose power in the hands of men as a way of delivering the benefits of rights to everybody. And Abigail wrote back to him, and she's like, well, not really convincing, but we'll give you one more try. But if it doesn't work, we women will foment a rebellion for voice and representation. So she named from the beginning what the issue was, namely, if you're gonna promise rights to everybody, you can't achieve that by giving power only to some, for the basic reason that absolute power corrupts, right? If you put power in hands that we can't share it, then you're not gonna protect all the rights. So she was having that conversation with him. Somebody else wrote to him to ask about the access of people without property to participation, free Africans to participation. In all cases, he wrote back in basically the same way. The rights are for everybody, but essentially we're gonna use this paternalistic system where only some people have power. So that's really what we've been wrestling with ever since in the country. Can we actually have a system that's about sharing power among all categories of people as the necessary thing for protecting the rights of all? And so fundamentally, that does bring Native Americans into the picture, but it took longer for Native Americans to be in the picture of that conversation than for women and people of African descent.
We have a question about rights from a Rhodes faculty member, Stephen Kipp, who mentions an off-cited dichotomy in political philosophy, the notion that individual rights produce competing claims to rights, which incidentally tend to violate other individual rights. And he gives an example: one's right to a firearm may be employed to violate another's right to free speech. And Professor Kipp asks, how might the Declaration help us navigate this apparent contradiction?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess on that, I would, I suppose I would somewhat challenge, in all honesty, the formulation of the question. That is, I would not say that it was the right to the firearm that violates the right to speech. It is the abuse of the use of the firearm that violated the right to speech. So I don't think, I mean, one might identify rights where one can see a direct conflict, and we often see that in the case, for example, of rights to freedom of religion versus rights to, we have protections around healthcare, various kinds, marriage equality, things like that. The cake baking example is a good one, where we have a clash between a religious claim and a claim to freedom of movement, basically the right to be able to move through commercial establishments, use all commercial establishments and the like. And so those are challenging points for sure. The question, I think, is, there's the basic category of rights that are needed for people to function and thrive in society seem to me necessary to protect universally and comprehensively. And then the question is, where you need to make accommodations and settlements, can you make accommodations and settlements so that the infringements on, for example, religious liberty are not excessive?
We had a number of questions that are kind of drawing us into the present, like that one, about the pertinence of the Declaration today. In particular, a cluster about civility. Rhodes alumna Franny Taylor asks, how do we as Americans return to living in a civil country? And Bob Nardo of Libertas School cites a number of surveys and then elaborates, it seems like an alarming trend in our public discourse to classify disagreement as evidence of the other side's false consciousness. Do we need to foster more mutual understanding in order to maintain a Republican form of government?
What do you guys think? Hand up if you think the answer is yes. Exactly. Yes, I mean, so for me, I think the question is how, right? How do we foster more mutual understanding? And it seems to be important for all of us just to recognize that pluralism is a fact of life in America, and it has always been a fact of life in America. Going back to James Madison again, in that same paper, Federalist 10, Madison makes the argument, freedom will bring diversity of thought. And he uses that phrase, diversity of thought. So that's back in the Federalist Papers. And that diversity of thought is in some danger of producing faction. And so the entire question is, how can we celebrate pluralism? And by pluralism, I mean our differences along every dimension. So differences of viewpoint and opinion and faith, and also demographic background, race and sex and gender and so forth. All of that fits under the category of pluralism. And we can name that fact about us as an empirical fact, and also, I think, uphold pluralism as a norm, an ethic for how we relate to each other, a norm of expecting to respect, relate, and cooperate with each other across all those lines of difference. But I think it's a cultural question. And so for all of us who are here and in various ways have responsibility for different organizations and institutions, the question is, how do we establish an ethos or a culture of pluralism? And so there's a lot of work to do, but yes, I think it's crucial work. We definitely need it.
So it's been about 10 years since you published the book, and maybe 25 years, you said, since you first started teaching in the Clemente program. If you were to rewrite the book now, what would be different? A lot has happened over the last decade, multiple presidential transitions, the Black Lives Matter movement, the COVID pandemic, Hamilton. What seems different? How would you, or maybe you've written a new preface?
I would put Hamilton in, I guess, maybe, so I could maybe get picked up as a musical.
Probably, yeah. You have a new preface coming out to the book. Is
There
that
will be
correct?
it's a very short new preface, and yes, so yes, there will be that. And what I've tried to do in that is sort of what I've done in that is make the point that how can a text that is really born in violence, right? It's a theory of revolution. It's launching a war. It's going to help people kill each other. How can a text that is born in violence help us in a moment where our problem is violence? And the paradox of the Declaration is that although it's a text born in violence, its core lesson is about peace, what it takes for a people who disagree with each other to find and have peace. So that's what I try to articulate in the prologue. I didn't really have a chance to do any more substantial rewriting. If I were doing more substantial rewriting, what I would actually add is the fuller story of how John Adams used the Declaration of Independence as a foundation for the abolition of enslavement in Massachusetts. I didn't know that full story when I published the book. So I've published a few articles and essays about that since then, but it's not fully in the book. There are little kind of hints and glimmers at it. But that would be the biggest thing. The Declaration belongs as much to John Adams as it does to Thomas Jefferson. And I wish we could all tell that story more fully, because it would give us our whole country, right? It's important just to recognize that there were such a diversity of perspectives right at the founding.
Community member Daphne Whitaker-Spite posed a question about artificial intelligence. How might artificial intelligence help or harm your plans to renovate democracy? And you've called AI a kind of double-edged sword.
Right, exactly. Oh my gosh. You guys are just like the students I met this afternoon. They have so many big, hard questions. So, all right. Okay, now you really want to have a conversation. Okay, here we go. So, it does kind of change everything. Okay? So I just said something about how social media has made geography no longer useful in helping to sort of shore up our representative institutions. The AI transition is even more significant than that. So we should think of it as something akin to the moment of electrification, where electricity changes everything. You have the era of the horse and buggy, then you have the era of cars and automobiles. We are living through a transition as significant as that. And I do think that the events we saw last week, plus actually what has happened in Nepal in the past week. I don't know how many of you guys have seen the news in Nepal, where the parliament fell and then they ended up having an election over Discord, okay? Because there wasn't time to actually run an election. So like, what are we gonna do? So they held an election over Discord. And the events of last week, in addition to being a terrible, terrible tragedy for a man, for his family, and for our nation, for two men, tragedies in different ways, for two families, and for our nation. In addition to being that tragedy, it was also a moment where we could see for the first time, I think, for the first time, how completely the infrastructure of social organization that's been built by technology overpowers our political institutions, makes them obsolete. That's what happened in Nepal too. The institutions were obsolete, couldn't keep pace. They couldn't actually do the thing of coordinating a democratic people. So that's what we have to deal with. And it does mean that there is a true urgency for upgrading our institutions so they can function in current conditions. We have got to unlock the paralysis. We have got to get our institutions responsive again and connected to the people. AI can be a resource to help with that. It's not just a dangerous or destructive tool, but we have to put it to work in alignment with the principles of democracy. That means thinking about how it can help us upgrade civic participation. What are all the ways in which people can participate more easily if we use AI? How can we make participation more rich and meaningful for people? Where and how can we use it to help decision makers decide more effectively, get a bigger solution space open for them? And there are some good examples in Taiwan and Estonia of doing that. And then similarly, how can we help make then the implementation of governmental decisions, whether that's service delivery or enforcement of regulations, more effective, more efficient, easier for people to experience and use, drawing on the resources of AI. So in other words, we have like a really big job to do to get our institutions renovated so that they can serve us, we the people who own our institutions. And AI both produces conditions of the challenge and also does, in fact, offer us some resources to handle that upgrading work. We kind of have to get on it real fast.
In 2021, you called on the governor of Massachusetts to activate the National Guard to prepare vaccination clinics at schools across the Commonwealth for speedy implementation of the pediatric vaccine rollout. And earlier in your book, Talking to Strangers, you discussed the role of the Arkansas National Guard in 1957, which initially blockaded the entrance of the Little Rock Nine before the Guard was eventually federalized by President Eisenhower. So you've thought a lot about the Guard and the role of the Guard. Can you speak to the use of the Guard in Los Angeles and DC and now Memphis?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a difficult and challenging moment. And the use of the Guard in the vaccines case in Massachusetts was a context in which there was community desire for vaccines. Massachusetts was a state where there was never really significant question or debate about that. And the challenge really was a delivery question. And so in that regard, I think I would say it's sort of like a perfect case for the use of the National Guard. That is to say, there was public legitimacy for the work that was being undertaken. The work was rights preservative for all involved, and the state governor was the person directing the work. In the case of Arkansas, obviously, as we all understand, there was a very bitter conflict over whether or not states would protect the rights of all people. And so the National Guard was being used in a way that was not rights preservative. And in that regard, I consider Eisenhower's federalization there reasonable. In the current context, it's not clear to me that troops are being deployed in rights preservative ways. And so I think it is worth our time to take a look and ask questions. It's also not clear to me that the stated causes for the deployment are always truthful. So as I understand it, crime rates have been falling, for example, in Memphis. Crime rates had been falling in Washington, D.C. In a context where the stated purpose for the use of the guards is false, then you have to ask the question, what's the real purpose? And in the absence of an accurate stated purpose and the need to consider what the real purpose might be, you have no choice but to consider what it means to have standing armies among people in times of peace. What is the use of that when there isn't actually a real stated purpose? Well, the Declaration suggests the use is just a general state of threat and communication of power. That's, from my point of view, not a sort of ethos that supports the health of a free people. And so I think it is reasonable to raise questions about that.
And if we could close on a note of optimism, I've got a couple of questions for you here. One is from Rhodes student Hoa Phan. What is one political policy that you think has worked out best this last year? An example of something that's actually working.
A policy that has worked well in the past year. All right. Okay, so what date is today? Today is September. So I have till last September to consider that question. I've got two for you. I've got two. They're both state level. Okay, I'm not gonna give you any national ones from either administration. All right, but I've got two state level policies for you that I think are excellent that I would encourage you to take a look at. One is from Utah and Governor Spencer Cox, Republican. The other is from Governor Wes Moore, Maryland, a Democrat. In Utah, Governor Cox signed a bill called the Digital Choice Act, I think is its title. And what this bill does is give users, that is to say all of us, ownership over the data that we create in social media platforms, and requires that social media platforms allow that data to be moved around, to be ported. So for example, if you're on one site and you build up a big list of contacts and networks on that site, currently you can't take that social graph with you if you move to a different platform. So for example, if you're on Twitter and you want to move to TikTok, you can't take your contact list from Twitter and move it over to TikTok. And that fact that you can't move that actually traps you on Twitter, all right? Because you don't want to rebuild your 10,000 followers or your 20,000 followers or whatever else. So you're trapped there. And there's a monopoly on your attention in your business, sort of unusually structured kind of monopoly. So the law requires portability of data, and that requires interoperability across platforms. So you have to be able to take your contact list from one place and go to the other. That's huge because it changes the balance of power between tech companies and all of us. And that's what we need. Sort of taking our kids back from tech, we need these kinds of rebalancing of power. So it's a very important law that I would encourage everybody to pay attention to. In Maryland, Governor Moore is doing something super interesting. It's called the Enough Initiative. And this is a poverty-fighting initiative where the approach to fighting poverty is to put power back in the hands of local communities. The initiative learns from and is modeled on Geoffrey Canada's Harlem Children's Zone, which you may have heard of, that's work that's been underway for more than 2 decades, where Geoffrey Canada is an educator, and he sort of mapped out a radius in Harlem. I can't remember whether it's 12 blocks by 12 blocks or precisely what it is, but he basically said, all the community members who are in this area are all going to be involved in taking responsibility for the success of children who are living in this zone. And what that means is we're going to basically set up a children's cabinet. All the churches, all the schools, any social service agency, they're all going to participate, and we're going to work on success planning for kids. We're going to make sure every kid who needs early education gets it. When kids need tutoring or counseling, we're going to make sure they get it. When they need guidance counseling for college, we're going to make sure they get it. And it has massively improved the well-being of kids in that zone and sort of broken the cycle of cross-generational poverty. That work has now sort of spread around the country. There's sort of 70 pilots around the country. But what Governor Moore has done is said, okay, we're going to do this statewide in Maryland. So for every community where concentrated poverty is at a certain level, we're going to give them a grant opportunity to get funding to basically function in this success planning way where all community stakeholders are participating. So there's no top-down blueprint for exactly what kind of interventions you have to do in your community. What there is instead is an invitation to people to solve the problem together with some support for learning from best practices elsewhere, capacity building, and then holding folks responsible and accountable for that. And so again, that's shifting the balance of power, right? Away from top-down policy blueprints to re-empowering communities, building up responsibility, local agency, and so forth. And both of those things, the sort of tech one balances the power back to all of us, and Governor Moore's shifting power back to communities, those to me are great policy advances.
And here's a last question. This is from Kat McRitchie's students at Crosstown High. If we place 2025 in the course of human events, what might the power of collective self-organization look like, and what happens if we lose that same power of collective self-organization?
Wow, again, such hard questions. Oh my goodness. Well, that's a great and beautiful question. Maybe I could answer that by saying what I hope for. So, we are an incredibly divided country. I don't have to tell you that. I was in England this summer in August, and people asked me the question, well, what's life really like there in America right now? And I said, well, the truth is, the terrible thing is the level of hate people have developed for each other is extraordinary and scary. That's what I said to people in August. The strange thing about that level of hate is that there are all kinds of indicators that point in another direction, that tell a different kind of story about who we are as a people. There's all kinds of survey data, actually, that shows that, like a supermajority of Americans, 75-80%, actually agree on a whole bunch of core values. That there are supermajorities on a range of policy questions, from things like, should people's voting rights be restored after they've served their felony convictions? The supermajority of Americans say yes to that, like 75%. It's really sort of surprising, both parties. And civic education, 80% of Americans think we should have more civic education. Should that education be honest and tell the story of slavery? 80% of Americans say yes to that question. Okay? So, for me, what I hope for, what I do, I spend a lot of time doing, is building coalitions that are linking people together across ideological divides. I won't bore you with all the context in which I'm doing that. It goes against the grain for people. There are actually challenges to it. You have to start with one person who's across a divide from you, and then ask them to invite 2 more friends. Well, you invite 2 more friends, you do some more sort of relationship building work, and you kind of keep snowballing it like that. But my hope would be that we could all learn how to do cross-ideological coordination and connection. So I think that's what I would say about 2025. I think 2025 is the time where we recognized that unless we could actually learn how to partner with people who are ideologically very different from us, we didn't really have a chance. And because we realized that, we faced that hard reality, we're like, all right, I might not like you so much, but I'm gonna hang out with you. I'm gonna get to know you. I'm gonna listen. I'm gonna try to be curious and understand your perspective. That we just decided we're gonna reorient our spirits. Because that's literally all it would take. If we could just reorient our spirits and be ready to listen to somebody so opposed to us, if many, many of us could do that, everything else would change. So,
Thank you so much.